Yes.
My name is Kathy House. I am the assistant at the community garden here at Duke Farms, and I want to welcome you to today's presentation, which is beginning gardening. So hopefully, if you're on the East Coast, you may be snowed in. We may have a little bit of snow here in central New Jersey, actually quite a bit. I think in the area where I live, we got about 20 inches. So hopefully everybody is starting to think about the warm spring that will be with us soon and starting to plan their gardens. So I'm going to handle some just general housekeeping issues before I turn the program over to our community garden coordinator. So just want to let everybody know that you're going to remain muted with no video throughout the program. You will have the ability to ask us questions, though. You can put those into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll either answer them as we go along. Melissa will cover a lot of information in the program. Otherwise, I'll try and categorize them, and she can answer them at the time that we have at the end of the program. The questions that you ask, though, we're going to ask that they are relative to beginning gardening, because there's a lot of information to cover and quite a few attendees. So if you have general gardening questions, you can feel free to email us at CG for community garden at dukefarms.org, and I'll put that email address in the chat session later. But just keep today's questions to basic gardening. Let's see, what else? We do have a lot of folks registered for today, over 1,000 at last count. So we may not be able to answer all the questions. I just want to set that expectation first. And the information that we're sharing today is the property of Duke Farms, and you can use it for educational and informational purposes only. If you do share it in any method, please be sure to credit Duke Farms for that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Melissa, and she'll get started with gardening for beginners.
Hey, Kathy, thank you so much, and welcome everybody. It's so exciting. I want to congratulate you all for coming today, because you're sort of taking the first step towards starting a garden, or maybe it's your second or third year, or maybe you've been doing it a long time and you just want to refresh some of your information. But thank you for joining us today. I am going to be posting in the chat right now a link. If you guys want, it's a handout of all the notes from today. So if you want to click on that link, you can then download and save the notes. You can print it off if you want to. And that will be sort of a summary of what I go over today, some of the numbers and things. That way you don't have to worry about missing them. You will not be receiving a copy of today's presentation via email anymore. But of course, as Kathy said, you can always email us if you need a refresher on certain bits of information. We have a lot of stuff to cover. I could probably talk about beginner gardening for 10 hours, but we have 1 hour today. Hopefully I can get all the information in. So I'm going to get started, and I'm going to share my screen and go ahead and get started. All right. So I was trying to think, actually I asked several people what topics should I cover when I talk about beginner gardening? What is the hardest thing for people that have really never put anything in the ground, or have, done it a little bit, but just need to kind of refine their skills. So I'm going to take you through the whole season. I'm going to take you through this part of the year in the wintertime when you're deciding what to plant and sketching out your garden and deciding where it's going to be. I'm going to take you through the whole summer, all of the maintenance that you're going to do on your garden. And then we're going to finish up and harvesting, of course. And then we're going to finish up with what to do to your garden in the fall. So lots and lots of information. Don't get overwhelmed. All we want you to do is sort of absorb a little bit of this. And then next year you can come back and take the class again, and maybe you'll absorb a little bit more. Okay, so I want to talk about what it means to grow organically. Here at Duke Farms, we have an organic community garden, and that means without the use of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, or other artificial agents. And you'll notice the word chemical is underlined, because there are organic fertilizers and pesticides that you are allowed to use. And so I want to kind of take you through quickly. If you're talking about soil, if you're going to be buying bagged soil, you want to make sure it is organic. So Miracle-Gro is not, you know, the evil devil, but people recognize the label. So we use that as an example of a non-organic soil. And you'll know it's not organic because it usually will say on the label, you know, slow release fertilizer or something like that. And those are chemical in nature, the ingredients that they have in there. So you want to avoid that. Beyond, you can go sort of beyond that organic, which is just not using chemical stuff. You can add compost to your soil to build it up. You can reduce tilling, which helps to build up the structure of your soil and will make your plants healthier and happier. When we talk about fertility, you're going to be avoiding, again, the non-organic fertilizers. There are organic options, and I will give you some of them by name that you may use. Weed management. So of course you're not going to be using chemical. I think most of you would know that by now. What do you do to get to manage your weeds? You're going to stop tilling. Tilling actually brings a lot of weeds to the surface. You're going to be hand pulling and using mulch to prevent weeds. For pest and disease management, if it's your very first year growing on your property, you probably won't have any pests or disease. They usually come after a few years. They sort of find your vegetable garden. If you do happen to see something, you want to try to purchase organic approved pest control. So something like 7 Dust, which is not organic. You wouldn't want that near the food that you eat. Rotating your crops, which means planting them in a different spot each year. That helps to reduce the pressure, because if there's any pathogens or insects in the soil, you're not going to be planting them in the same spot that year. You're going to be moving them around. Hand picking insects, things like, you know, large beetles and things like that, that you can actually just pick and squish or drop in a bucket of soapy water instead of using chemicals. And you may look into using row cover, which is basically just like a little very light gauzy cover you can throw over your crops to exclude some of the more common insects. But like I said, if you're a new gardener, that's sort of the lowest thing on your list, and I wouldn't worry too much about like insects and all that kind of stuff in your very first year. Most importantly, when you go to the nursery or your local agway to buy any sort of material for your garden, you want to just look for one of these 2 labels, OMRI or USDA organic, and that's just going to tell you that it's approved for organic use, and those are the products that we recommend for your garden. So the next step is deciding what you're going to grow. Now, the wonderful thing about these online webinar style classes is that we can host so many people. People can just pop on right from their homes, and we can accommodate so much more people. In a class like this, normally at Duke Farms in Hillsborough, New Jersey, which is right in the central part of New Jersey, I have usually about 30 to 45 people in a class. And as Kathy said, we had close to 1,000 people register for this class today. So good job for that. And I don't know where all of you are though. So that's the challenge. I usually show this map and we zoom right in onto the central part of New Jersey. But of course you could be anywhere in the United States and you could be anywhere around the world for all I know. But what you want to do is you want to find out what growing zone you're in. If you're in the United States, this map is called the USDA planting zone map. So you can get a copy for yourself and find out, and you can sort of zoom in even closer and find out your planting zone. As I said, here in the central New Jersey, we are in zone 6B. And what the zones tell you is the temperature and average frost dates, and also it's related to the amount of precipitation that you get. Here in zone 6B, our last frost date of the season is approximately May 15th. That means up to May 15th, it's possible that we get a sub-freezing temperature at night. And what that means is I can't plant out any crops that are going to die in the frost. There's certain crops like tomatoes and eggplant and basil and peppers that do not appreciate being frosted and will probably die or be severely injured if they're outside after that, you know, when it's frosting. So you want to wait till after that May 15th frost date to plant them out. There are other crops that you can sneak out before that don't mind some of that frost, and I'm going to tell you what those crops are. The planting zone also tells you what your first frost date is. And here in zone 6B, our first frost date is approximately October 15th. So that means on or about that date, you're going to start getting some nighttime frosts. And again, those sensitive crops are not going to last through those frosts. So what can you grow here in New Jersey? And, most of the United States, these are pretty common crops. Of course, it's going to vary greatly if you live in other parts of the world, very far north or very far south. close to the equator. But these are some of my favorites. I leave off, you know, tomatoes and eggplant and basil because those seem to be sort of the obvious and the ones that most people grow. Cucumbers, and they're perfectly fine. And if that's what you want to grow, I recommend go forth and plant those things. But I just wanted to explain to you that there's so many more options and so much more variety. You can probably, you know, figure out 50 different vegetables that you could grow and be successful in your own backyard. I want to point out on this diagram that strawberries and asparagus are perennial plants. That means when you plant them, they grow back year after year. They're not annuals that you would have to plant each year. So if you're going to plant strawberry or asparagus, you want to make sure you plant it in a dedicated bed that's not going to change year to year. I get often asked, what are my favorite beginner crops? You know, what are some of the easier things for people to grow? And some of the easiest ones that I recommend if you really want to have like immediate success is lettuce. Lettuce is a very easy crop. You can buy it in the nursery as like little tiny lettuce plants, or you can buy a packet of seeds and literally sprinkle it on the surface of your soil, and it will start to grow into beautiful red, green leaves that you can harvest either as a lettuce head if you're very patient, or you can just clip leaves here and there for salads as you go along. And that's a really easy crop to get started with because it germinates very quickly and gives you sort of that immediate success. Sweet potatoes is another crop that I enjoy growing. Although it's a really long season for sweet potatoes, you need to plant them in May and they don't get harvested until October. The nice thing about sweet potatoes is there's very few insects and disease that are associated with sweet potatoes. They're very hardy. You don't really even have to water them barely. And when you harvest them, they will last forever. So whatever sweet potatoes I grow, I harvest in October, I eat them all the way through the following May. And they will last that long, just sort of at room temperature. So that's kind of a fun one if you're interested in that idea of extending your eating and growing more of what you eat throughout the winter time. Garlic is another lovely crop, pretty easy to grow. The only problem with garlic here in our zone, we do plant garlic in the fall. In certain warmer climates, you can plant it in the spring. So check again with your growing zone. You basically plant a clove of garlic. One clove will grow into one entire head, and you harvest them right in the summer, and then you can dry them, and they also will last for the entire winter as long as you have them. So again, these are just some ideas. Think a little bit outside the box. Think about, you know, what are some things you could grow that you maybe have never thought about before. Do start small though. I encourage you to start small because you don't want to be tilling up your entire backyard and then getting quickly overwhelmed. Start with one garden bed, maybe two, and then you can always expand year after year. And the fall is actually a great time to build new garden beds. So if you love the garden season after this, you know, this summer and fall are over, then you can always add more in the fall and be all ready for next year to have your new and expanded garden. So some things to consider when you're making this list. And if you have a piece of paper and pencil with you, I encourage you to start thinking and making a list of what you want to grow, because that's going to help you decide how big your garden needs to be and how much space you're going to need. Think about what you eat, what you and your family eat, and start there. You know, you don't want to plant a bunch of stuff that no one in your house is ever going to eat. You want to grow what's easy. So again, try the lettuce out. Try some kale is pretty easy as well. But if your family doesn't like kale, or Swiss chard is always a great example. Swiss chard is relatively easy to grow, and kale, and people in my family just do not like it. So we always have this overabundance of kale and Swiss chard, which are very beautiful in the garden, but no one's really eating them. So they're kind of eating up space. And if you have a small space, you don't want that to happen. So really think carefully about what your family will eat. However, I do encourage you to challenge yourself to find new recipes. I found some new recipes over the year for turnips. So where I can sneak turnips into mashed potatoes or different like latkes, and my children don't even know that they're there, which is a fun mom success for me. So do encourage yourself to look up new recipes for some of these very easy to grow vegetables so that you can use them in your kitchen. Growing what you can't buy is a great bit of advice. So like these, for instance, these beautiful purple potatoes or a striped heirloom tomato, they're not things that you can find in the grocery store. So leave the stuff that you can find in the grocery store, you know, off your garden list and plant some things that are going to be unique to your table. Something that saves you money. Herbs always come to mind when I think about saving money, because a bundle of rosemary in the grocery store is like $2.99 or something. And you can buy a plant of rosemary from the nursery, probably for the same price. It's going to grow the entire year for you. You can actually then dry it and use it all throughout the winter time. So that's going to save you a significant amount of money if you use them, of course. And then, as I said before, always try to add something new. Every year in my garden, I try to add a new vegetable or fruit, something that's going to challenge me as a grower and as a chef. And so this year, I think I'm going to be adding artichoke to my garden. I've tried several years and I've never been successful. It's a little bit tricky of a crop. So I'm going to give that one a try, but I encourage you to look up a new vegetable that either you've never eaten or you've never grown, and give that a whirl and add that to your list of things you might want to try. So now you sort of have a beginning inkling plan of this garden. You can start to see it come to shape. You have this list of crops, and now you have to think about how much space you have. So you can do it one of two ways. You can assign the space and then fill in the vegetables, or you can make your list of vegetables and then build a space to accommodate all of those fruits and vegetables. It doesn't really matter. Whatever works for you is fine. So I love graph paper, especially when it's beautiful snow is on the ground and I'm sitting inside with my warm mug of tea. I love to get out a piece of graph paper and my colored pencils and just start dreaming and sketching of all different garden iterations that I can come up with. You know, graph paper works well because obviously you can have your exact measurements right on the paper, but you don't even have to start with your exact measurements. You can start with sketches and designs. When you design a garden, you do not have to stick to rectangle beds. You do not have to stick to straight lines. You can use triangles and circles. You can have arches and trellises if you so desire. You can have some things in pots placed right alongside some of the garden beds that you build. So there's really no rules here. Actually, I shouldn't say there's no rules. There are two rules. The rule where when you're locating your garden in your yard, if you haven't done that yet, you want to make sure of two things. You want to make sure, number one, that your garden is going to get as much sun as it possibly can get in your yard. You know, full sun is about 8 hours a day. Here in New Jersey, we get about 14 hours of sunshine in the middle of the summer, and the plants are happier for the more sun. The question I always get is, I have a lot of shade, what can I grow in a space that has a lot of shade? And you are limited. You can grow some of the greens, some of kales and chards, and maybe even broccoli and cabbage can sneak into a shaded environment, but you definitely will not be successful with any fruiting crops. So tomatoes, cucumbers, eggplant, that sort of thing. The other thing that I would encourage you to think carefully about before you site your garden is drainage. So if you see this picture down on the bottom right, a garden that is going to hold a lot of water so that when you plant your crops, the roots of the crops may be sitting in a soggy space is not going to do as well as a garden that's in a well-drained space. Now, there's a couple ways around it. Of course, if you raise your beds, which I do encourage you to do, you're going to raise up off of that drainage issue, but it's not going to solve it entirely because plant roots do like to reach deep into the soil. So they're going to reach a foot or two down there. You're never going to raise your beds that high. So if you have the option, site your garden in a space that is going to drain nicely and get the most amount of sunshine. So when you're thinking about garden beds, I encourage you to create wide raised beds. They can be any shape, as I said before. They do not need to have wooden boundaries. You see this garden on the right is just sort of a mounded up soil. The width, the reason we recommend wide beds is because the roots then can really sort of stretch out both deep into the soil, but also to the left, to the right, to the front, and the back of the plant. You really want, one of the golden rules of garden, setting up a garden bed system like this is that you're never going to step into the garden bed. You want to have defined paths and growing space. So you can see in these pictures, the paths are defined by wood chips or strawed over areas. You're never going to step into that garden bed. So that means the soil is going to maintain nice and fluffy. It's not going to become compact at all. So all those roots can really stretch out in a full circle around the plant. I encourage you, again, if your beds are not built yet, if you're excuse me, if you're starting from scratch, you want to make a space that's comfortable for you. You don't want to have a space that you can't even really turn around, or you're trying to use a shovel and you're bumping into the bed behind you. It's intriguing and for new gardeners to have as much growing space as possible and reduce the walking space, because then of course you can plant more plants. But this can cause problems because you're going to be uncomfortable. So these are the general dimensions that I kind of recommend. It's flexible, but the width of the garden bed, I would say somewhere between 2 and 4 feet. You need to be able to reach the center of your garden bed. So if you can stand on both sides, then 4 feet is fine. If you can only, get to your garden bed from one side, then I would say err on the 2 foot width. The length really makes no difference. A couple things though, remember you're not going to be stepping in your beds. So if you have a 20-foot long garden bed that you can't step into, you're going to have to walk all the way to the end and then back up the other side every time you want to cross over. And if you use wooden bed edges, I would say 12 feet is the max, because the wood does start to bow as you get to those longer lengths, even if you put braces. So I would cut it off at, somewhere between 8 and 12 feet, I usually do, and then start a new bed. The path size has to do with, your size and what you're using. I love to kneel when I'm gardening. I like to get down on the ground and, sit on the ground and pull weeds. So I like to make my path size basically the size of me kneeling. But if you have a wheelbarrow, or if you have other tools that you want to have access to in those pathways, just make sure you measure everything and set it up beforehand, because now is your chance. Because if you don't do it now, chances are you're going to end up moving beds and really making it more of a comfortable space. So I just wanted to kind of take you through this example. So this is one of the beds in our community garden. This is a 10 by 10 garden space. It had nothing in it. So the gardener arrived and had this like sort of blank slate, which some of you may have in your own backyard. And so it's like, well, where do I go from here? So I encourage them to just start to sketch. So we came up with this idea, maybe you want to have one long bed and you want to have 2 small beds. In our community garden, you need to be able to access, to get in and on both sides. So you don't want to have, the garden beds attached, because then of course you wouldn't be able to get to the other side. You can see there's a wider path in the middle and then a more narrow path off to the right. And so this was sort of the idea that we sketched out. And then of course we'd start to build the bed and put them in place. Before we get to the building of beds, right now the stage you're at is in the sketching stage. So you might have a piece of paper in front of you and you might have sketched down some ideas already based on some of the pictures I've just showed you. But we want to think about what you're going to plant and how much space it's going to need, because like I said, that's going to really dictate how much of a garden bed you create. And so I wanted to show you this diagram. This is a diagram of square foot gardening, which really is sort of the closest spacing that you'd ever have for crops. You can leave a little bit more room, but this is like the tightest they can go. So for instance, if you want to plant a tomato plant, according to this diagram, would take up 1 square foot of space. A lettuce, on the other hand, you can plant 4 lettuce in 1 square foot of space, and you can plant 9 beets in 1 square foot of space. So you can see the smaller the plant, a beet is a tiny plant, lettuce medium, and a tomato is large. The smaller the plant, the more you can sort of pack in. So another way to think about it is, what does your family eat? How much comes out of 1 plant of each variety? Now that's hard to say specifically. And so these are really just rough numbers on the left. But for instance, if you plant 1 tomato plant, you might get somewhere around 10 large or 10 slicing tomatoes. But if you planted cherry tomatoes, you're going to end up with hundreds of cherry tomatoes. 1 seed of something always grows into 1 plant. So a carrot seed is going to give you 1 carrot. A beet seed is going to give you 1 beet. So that's an important thing to understand. A spinach plant or any leafy green usually will grow into a small little rosette or small head, and usually you can cut it twice. So you're going to get maybe 5 or 6 leaves of spinach off of 1 seed or 1 plant. You cut it and then it's probably going to regrow. You can get a second cut out of that. So that will help sort of inform you of how many spinach plants you need. A zucchini plant, gosh, they vary. Sometimes you get two zucchini and then they die, and sometimes you get 50 zucchini. So that's one to be careful with. They get kind of large. You can see they're in the extra large area on this diagram. And so if you don't like zucchini, maybe don't plant them, or maybe, you know, just plant one to try it out. A broccoli plant, again, is going to do one large head or one medium-sized head and several small shoots. I'm going to switch my screen over to a web application. This program, which is just, you know, you can go on the internet, and it's just, the web address is growveg, growveg.com. They have an online garden planner, which I love and I find to be quite helpful for new gardeners and people that have been growing for 50 years. They do have a free, I think it's a free 30 days, and then there is a membership, but it's relatively inexpensive and it's so fun to use that you won't mind paying for it. So what I did was I went ahead and started to sketch out the garden beds that I showed you that we designed for our 10 by 10 growing space. You can see there's, you know, a 10 feet, there's a ruler on the left and right side of here, and I just went ahead and dragged the boxes to the size that I wanted them to be. So this size is, it's a 3.5 foot wide garden bed, and this one is 10 feet long, and these are 3.5 feet wide by 4 feet. So you can see I have a nice big aisle here, and then I have a smaller space in the middle there. So now what you can do is you can start to add plants. You can go over to the plant tag and you can start to pop things in. So I'm going to add a tomato just because people are always asking about tomatoes. We'll put a small tomato plant in there. Okay, so all you're going to do is click on the plant. I do want to think about where I plant my plants as far as shading. So a tomato is a pretty large plant. You don't want to shade the plants behind it or next to it. So really pay attention in your yard where the south facing, I didn't say this because I don't know where you guys are gardening. In New Jersey, we have a southern sun because we're above the equator. So the sun is sort of at the equator, right? It's coming from our south. So take a look at a map and figure out where your sun is coming from, or just walk outside and figure where that is. So if this is the south side, this is where the sun is, say it's at the top of my map, I want to put my tomato on the northern side. I want to put the taller stuff sort of on so that it doesn't get shaded behind it, because the sun, again, is going to be shining this way. The shadows are going to be cast down here. So here's one tomato. It's going to show me how much space I need. And what you can do is you can add more. Oops, sorry about that. You can drag, say I really love tomatoes, okay, and I want to get lots of tomatoes. So I can sort of see, I can fit, okay, I can fit 4 tomatoes in about half of my garden bed. So then I'm going to switch over because I love lettuce so much. And I'm going to plant some lettuce because I think everyone should grow some lettuce. Okay, so this is like a head of lettuce. So lettuce is pretty short, right? Now, if you don't know how tall a plant gets, you can get that information right off of the seed packet or the plant tag. But a head of lettuce basically grows right out of the ground. So it's only as tall as the actual head of lettuce. So I'm going to pop my lettuce in there and I'm going to think, how many lettuce can I fit up here in my garden bed? So I'm going to stretch this out and I can cram 8 heads of lettuce on this end of this garden. So what other crops should I tuck in here? How about some green beans? Green beans, especially pole beans, are going to grow really tall. So you're going to need a trellis for them. But bush beans are going to be short. They're only going to grow to about 18 inches tall, maybe 2 feet. And so they don't need to be trellised. So they're medium height. So maybe I'm going to tuck the beans in here. How many beans can I fit? Remember, that's 1 bean plant. So I can start to stretch it out and see how many beans. So this is a really lovely software because right from here, you can start to plan your garden, dream up. You can fit a lot of food in a small little 10 by 10 vegetable plot. Once you get a little bit more advanced, you can think of, do I need all 8 heads of lettuce to be growing at the same time? Probably not. So maybe I'm going to plant 2 heads this week, 2 heads the following week, then maybe wait a week and plant a couple more. And then I'm going to sort of spread out my lettuce production. So there are all these tricks that you can start to use. And I think in gardening is the sort of thing that you just never, ever finish learning. I learn things every single year. From this garden design, once I finish it, you can give it a little name and you can go to this plant list and it's going to tell you exactly how many plants you have. And then it even gives you, you can actually enter your frost dates into this software and it'll tell you when you can start planting things out. So you can see lettuce, I can plant out in April. It's pretty frost hardy. Tomato, I'm waiting till that May 15th date. So it gives you lots of information in this garden planner. So I encourage you, even if you don't end up paying for it, to go ahead and check it out and play around with it. It's a lot of fun. All right, so we need to go ahead and set up the space. You had your sketch done or you'll have it done before you get to this spot. You're not gonna go outside and actually start digging until probably April. You wanna make sure the ground is drained and nice and warm. You do not wanna be digging in frosty soil because that is gonna really impact your soil structure and the success of your garden. So sort of walk outside and make sure it's a nice warm spring day and the ground is not sopping wet anymore. I get a lot of questions and I'm sure you guys have a ton of questions on how to go ahead and set up my garden space. If you have a lawn like this gardener here in the top right corner, I feel like most people are starting from a lawn environment. That's the hardest, right? I mean, it's better if you come to our community garden and you have just a patch of dirt, all you have to do is start digging and it'll fluff right up and you'll be ready to plant. But if you have grass, it does need a little bit of prep work. And if you go on YouTube and look up how to build a raised bed garden, it will 9.5 times out of 10 tell you to buy bagged soil. It might even tell you to lay a fabric down on the ground and pour the soil on top, which really is confusing to me because I'm not sure why people would think that their ground needs to be separated from their vegetable garden, unless of course you live in an environment that has been contaminated and you're at risk for contaminants in the soil. Most regular residential neighborhoods don't have that concern. So what I would recommend you doing is to go outside, find your space, the space that gets nice and sunny and is relatively well drained, good access to water perhaps, to your hose, good access to your back door so that you're not walking a half a mile to get one, sprig of basil for your pasta sauce. You're going to mark it out. So you're going to actually get your ruler and your tape measure, maybe some spray paint, maybe some string, and you're going to actually lay out the space that has now been sketched either on the Grow Veg website or into your little graph paper notebook. You're going to start to dig it up. I think this is a really important part because if you've been walking on that grass for years and years and years, it's probably very compact. When roots hit compact soil, they don't like to grow through it. So it's worth your while to do some digging to break up some of that compaction down to, I would say, about a foot. You can see the large shovel he's using. The blade of a shovel is usually, about a foot. So I use that as my measuring device. Try to get all the way through, down a foot, just sort of breaking up that grass, turning it over. And you can see just by doing that, his garden is starting to raise up. It's starting to fluff up with the soil that he already had there. The next thing that you're going to do, if you want to build a wooden frame, now would be the time to build that frame and sort of place it where you've started to dig up the soil. Then what I would say to do is to add in some compost. So if you have a home compost pile, you can use home compost. If you don't, you can go ahead and buy some bagged compost. If you're doing a humongous garden, you can get a bulk delivery of compost. I would say to use about 50% by volume of the garden bed size in compost in this very first year. So I gave like some number examples. If your bed is 3.5 by 10 and you're going to, you're going to raise it up about 6 inches, that's about 5 to 8 cubic feet, which is several bags of compost. You could go a little bit lower than that. You could certainly go by 25% by volume, whatever you're comfortable with. If by that point you mix the compost into all of that grass, you haven't removed the grass is going to break down. And then you're looking at it and you're like, I still think it needs to be a little bit higher to fill up my wooden space. Then at that point, I would say, go ahead and buy, go ahead and buy a couple bags of topsoil, make sure it's organic, or at least has no chemicals. And you can go ahead and top off your garden bed with that soil then. All that you need to do at that point is wait a couple weeks, wait about 2 weeks because the grass that you turned into that garden needs to biodegrade. It's going to break down and it's going to actually end up feeding your plant. It's like another form of compost. If you have a spot, couple sort of troubleshooting. Here's an example of just a brand of compost that I love the Coast of Maine products. And so this is a really quality organic product if you have access to it. You need to buy a bagged compost. So I'm going to pause for a moment to see if there's any questions, because I know there's always a ton of questions on like, what kind of soil do I use and what do I build? So I anticipated 2 questions, which one is, if you have really compacted soil, like you live in a space that's just like shale or a ton of roots and you can't get through it, go ahead and skip the digging and just start to lay stuff on top of the ground. What's going to happen is the biological activity in the garden by adding compost is going to encourage, worms and other creatures, and it will eventually start to break down and loosen up your soil underneath. And you can, in the fall, maybe try to just sort of dig and turn your soil a little bit to loosen that up. But if it's really gonna prevent you from growing, is if your ground is too hard, go ahead and skip that. And then here's some specs on the type of wood. The most important thing is that it's just not treated. And I gave you some examples of dimension. Kathy, are there any other questions about, what we've talked about so far?
There are a few questions. Is manure considered compost? And along those lines, would you use peat moss?
Okay, great questions. Yes, manure is considered a composting product because it is organic and natural. Be careful of where you source it from. I know some people have friends that, are horse farmers or cow farmers, and they can drive down the road and grab some manure. The 2 things to be aware of is make sure it's fully composted, so that it's been sitting there for like a year or 2. And that, especially if you're applying it in the spring. In the fall, you can get away with it being a little less because it's going to sit the whole winter in your garden. But also be aware of medications, especially in horse manure. Some of the medications are residual and will stay in that manure and then therefore end up in your garden. So just know your source. And if you buy bagged manure, you really can't get it certified organic. So it's a little bit of a risk, but it's usually, I would say, probably okay. And peat moss, no, I wouldn't apply peat moss. The only thing I use peat moss for is in seed starting. So if you're going to start seeds in little trays inside your house, there's really no need for peat moss in the garden. A lot of people think it's going to loosen clay soils. The best thing to loosen clay soils is just using compost. The peat moss is really not something that is needed in that respect. Anything else there, Kathy?
Along those lines, do you use biochar?
Yeah, people love that. I have never used it. It has some questionable sustainability behind it, but I've never used it. So I can't really speak to it. All that I use in my garden is I use the soil. My garden is, 11 years old now, I think. The soil that's been there all that time, I've added some topsoil here and there, and then I use homegrown compost or bagged compost. And then I will use granular fertilizer every once in a while, and I will give you the name of that in just a moment.
A question about Grow Veg. Does it customize the plants based on where you live? Like, does it take into account your growing zone?
That's a good question. I've never thought about that. I don't think it would show me orange tree here in New Jersey because it knows, you do put in your growing zone. So yes, it probably does, but that's interesting. I'm going to write that down.
Yeah, I didn't know the answer.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. That's a great question. But I know that you can put in your frost dates. Okay, we're going to move on in the interest of time. So now that you have your plan, where are these plants coming from, right? So are you going to do transplants or are you going to do seeds? So this is sort of a handy reference chart of things that, on the left in the purple really do better as transplants. So you can either buy those in the garden center or you can grow them yourself in your basement or in your dining room or wherever you're growing your own seeds. And we do have a seed starting workshop coming up on March 1st. So if you're interested in learning about seed starting, join me for that one. But the middle one is sort of either way. You can either buy them, start them on your own, or you can really just tuck a seed right in the ground. That's the easiest way to do it. And then these guys on the right, I would say mostly you want a direct seed, especially the carrots and radish. Like, don't buy them from the garden center. If they're trying to sell them to you, they really do not like to be transplanted. The other ones may be okay. So the pros and cons here, the pro of purchasing plants from your garden center is obviously it's very easy. You just walk in there, you purchase what you need, you go home, you plant it that day. It is way more expensive to do that than to plant seeds. So on these kind of questionable plants in the middle. So if you want to grow a cucumber, you can probably buy a 4-pack of cucumbers from the garden center for, $4, but you can buy a pack of seeds for probably less than that, and you get 50 cucumber plants. So it is less expensive to purchase seeds. But if you are a new gardener, I highly recommend just using transplants. Maybe try seeds, like I said, for lettuce. Just get yourself a pack of lettuce seeds, sprinkle them out, see how you do, sort of dipping your toe in the water of starting things from seeds. And then you can increase on each year what your variety is that you're growing. We do have cool season crops and warm season crops. So again, depending on where you are in the world is going to tell you when you can plant these guys out and how long they're going to live. Here in New Jersey and all of the Northeast and probably the central part of the country as well. These cool season crops on the left, they're the ones that I told you don't mind having a little bit of frost. And the crops on the right, the warm season guys, they do mind. So it's really, really important that you wait to plant out these guys on the right until after that frost date. So my girlfriend said to me, well, what do I do if I miss the April planting date and I get so confused? What should I do then? So I think the easy answer to that is just wait until your frost date to plant everything. That's what I did my first couple years of gardening. I never even knew that you could plant stuff before May, and it was just easier for my brain. So, just keep it simple for yourself. The only things I would say, these guys on the bottom left, carrots, radish, spinach, and peas, they really don't love to germinate. They don't do well when it's as warm as it is in May. So I would just cross those off the list. You can do everything else either by seed or by transplant after that May 15th date. If you're interested in trying, you're ready in mid-April, go ahead and start some of those cool season crops. But I just like to give you an easy out. You don't have to just skip everything. And of course, if you're not ready till June 1st, plant everything on June 1st. There's nothing wrong with that. There is a point in time where it would be too late. By July, I would say you're really not going to get many tomatoes if you're only planting them in July, because it does take a certain amount of time for things to grow. Okay, I'm going to switch my screen again, and I'm going to give you, I took a video a year ago in May, and it's so lovely to watch because it's warm and sunshiny and the birds are singing. But I'm going to take you through a demonstration of planting out a transplant in your garden so that you can sort of watch and see in real time as it happens. So here you go.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to my garden. Today we are going to be going through the process of planting out some vegetables. So we're going to talk about the difference between planting seeds and planting garden transplants. I'll talk a little bit about which vegetables do better using the various methods, and we'll go through the whole process. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about planting a start or a transplant or a seedling, whatever it is that you want to call it. You may have started these yourself inside your house as seeds in your basement. Those of you that took our vegetable seed starting class might have done that, but you can also just purchase vegetable starts. Either way, it's going to be the same exact process. So this is a pepper, and this guy was started on March 20th. Grown for about a month, maybe 6 weeks, and then I transplanted it to this little container. I think it was May 1st, so it's been growing for another couple weeks. I've had it outside for since that time, since May 1st, kind of hardening off. And hardening off means just kind of bringing it outside in the sun for a few hours a day in the wind, bringing it back inside and gradually introducing it to the outdoor environment. So this guy is well hardened off, and we are ready to plant him. So before you get ready to transplant or plant stuff out in your garden, you have to determine where you're going to plant it. So you have to consider your garden layout. Maybe you have a crop rotation plan. Crop rotation means not planting the same family of plants in the same spot year after year. So in this bed, I have some onion family plants, and I'm going to do my peppers and my eggplant. Peppers and eggplant are both in the tomato family. So next year I would have to not plant those type of plants in here. This is an Olympus pepper. So for pepper spacing, you can look at the seed packet. So here's the seed packet for the Olympus pepper. This actually says pepper plants should be 18 inches apart. I think that's entirely too much. And plant spacing really is a very fluid thing, and you can kind of play around with it. There's square foot gardening, which puts plants really close together. And then there's row planting, which spaces plants really far apart. So you can kind of play around and see what works for you. For peppers, I usually aim for about 8 to 10 inches between plants. There's sort of an old wives' tale that peppers like to hold hands when they're mature. So a mature plant should sort of be touching each other. And I've done that for many, many years and gotten really great success. So I'm going to continue doing that. So to get this guy in the hole, I'm going to move apart. I usually have mulch on my beds all the time, unless I'm started really small plants or some seeds. But in this case, I like to keep the mulch on there. I'll spread the mulch apart, and I'm just going to dig a little hole, loosen up the soil. And this bed has already been prepared last fall with adding compost and cover crop and all that. If you need to add any of that, you can go ahead and do that, a week or two before you get to planting. I usually add a little bit of general purpose fertilizer to the hole just to make sure as the roots start to grow, they have really good nutrition right off the bat, and it gives them a really good start. So I just put kind of like a little, maybe like a tablespoon or so in the hole. This is Coast of Maine plant food. I love this brand. I also love just the Espoma brand of organic plant fertilizer. So it's just called Garden Tone. It's just a general plant food. Okay, so to get it out of the pot, you want to kind of loosen it up a little bit so you're not, it comes out nice and smoothly. You want to be really careful not to damage the stem of the plant. So really kind of what I do is I hold it gently, and then I really just kind of dump it out, and I kind of squeeze until it comes out on its own. You can see the roots of this guy reach to the bottom of the pot. It's not really filled up that well. It could have stayed in here probably another 2 weeks or so. But because it's nice and warm, I'm ready to plant it out. Peppers need nighttime temperatures consistently in the 50s. And I looked for the week ahead, and that's pretty much where we are right now. So I feel comfortable planting this guy out. So you want to be really kind of gentle not to disturb the roots too much. So we're going to just kind of place this guy in the hole. And then we're going to backfill with our soil nice and gently. You're going to plant it right up to the level that it was in the pot. You don't want to fill up the soil any higher than that, or the plant will be stressed. Smooth it out. I really kind of press the soil in place so that it settles it nicely in there. And then I'm going to water it. There we go. My pepper plant is all tucked in. I watered it nicely so that the roots or the soil settles nicely around it. I have my label. I like to label the variety because if I love this pepper plant, like if it produces really awesome peppers, which I do know that Olympus peppers are so delicious. If you like a bell pepper, definitely worth trying this variety. I put the date on the back so I remember when I planted it out. According to the package direction, these guys will be ripe 65 days. They'll be producing green peppers. In 85 days, they will producing red peppers. All green peppers will turn to red peppers eventually, which a lot of people don't realize. Green pepper is actually an unripe pepper. So I have a good long time. I'm going to get this guy watered for probably the first week. I'll make sure it stays nice and moist, water it daily unless it's going to rain. After that, I can cut back. And really, I barely water my plants. I water them maybe once or twice a week if it's really hot, and I water nice and long and slow. So I would water this bed for like 15 minutes or something and let the water really go nice and deep. That encourages the roots to grow nice and deep, and that means I won't have to water as often, which I love. And also, I always try to keep a mulch. This is just leaves that I saved from last fall. That is going to hold in moisture as well.
All right. We're going to go back to the PowerPoint. You can actually see that full video on the Duke Farms YouTube channel. If you want to watch, I did go through planting seeds directly. So if you want to watch the rest of that or watch it again, you can go to YouTube and watch that video. Okay, so let's talk. I gave a lot of information in that video about maintaining the garden all summer long. And so there's sort of 4 key elements to this. So number 1 is mulch. I said that many times in that video, and I showed you. You can use straw that you purchase from a garden center. You can use leaves if you have any left over from the fall, or if you think about it this fall to save a bunch. You can use dried grass. If you mow your lawn, if you don't use any chemicals, you can just dry that and use that as well. That's going to hold the moisture into your garden. It's going to reduce weeds, and it's also going to add a little bit of organic material to your garden as it breaks down. Keeping ahead of weeds is critical. This is the one thing that makes people want to give up in July when it's 110 degrees and your garden is filled with weeds. Using a mulch is going to significantly reduce the amount of weeds that you have. And the other thing I would say is just pull them when they're small. Just every time you go out to your garden, spend the first couple minutes just pulling weeds, and then they really will be very little if you have a good layer of mulch on there. Watering, I talked about watering long and slow and deep, whether you're using a hose or a watering can. I think it's much better to use a hose just because a watering can you'd be more likely to water less because you're just going to water that top inch. You don't want to keep filling it up. So having a hose close by is a really good thing. You can also purchase what's called a moisture meter. A moisture meter, basically you poke down into your soil a couple inches and it tells you if it's dry, moist, or wet. You don't have to water when the top feels dry because you really want to go a couple inches down. If you don't have a moisture meter, you can of course just use your finger and see if you need to water. Fertilizing, this is really optional, and if it's your first year of gardening and you have a good amount of compost in there, you may not have to fertilize at all. But I showed you that picture of the Coast of Maine granular fertilizer. This is the other one, the Espoma. Biotone or Garden Tone, they're relatively the same. I usually just put a little bit in the hole at the time of planting, and that's kind of where I go from there. I do love using liquid fertilizers. So something like a liquid kelp or a liquid fish emulsion, you basically mix into your watering can and then water your plants with it, maybe once every 1 to 2 weeks. Or once a month, whenever you get to it, it really is going to increase your yield and increase the vigor of your plants. Now, harvesting. So I've taken you through all of this information about how to grow these spectacular plants. Make sure you harvest them, make sure you cook with them. It's really, I don't have enough time to go through how to know when everything is ready. But the fruiting crops like beans and peppers and tomatoes, you want to just read the label, see how big it's supposed to get, do a little research. Sugar snap peas are supposed to be nice and plump when you pick them. Whereas snow peas you pick when they're nice and flat. Things like onions, garlic, and potatoes actually die above ground before you start to pull them out. So there's good indicators for when they're ready. Most of your root crops, this is a picture of beets, most of your root crops are gonna sort of pop above ground a little bit when they're ready to harvest, and you can see how big they are. So I know those beets are the size I want them to be, and so you can pull them at that point. Last but not least, when you get to the fall, you've made it, you've planted and you've weeded and watered and harvested, and now you want to do it again. You decided you are a gardener for life and you're committed. Like I said, the fall is a great time to add new garden beds to your yard. But what you want to do on the existing ones and even any new ones, you're going to add some compost at that point, remove some of the old plant debris, get yourself just 1 to 2 inches of compost each and every fall. So if you remember back when in the spring, when I talked about setting up your garden, I talked about adding about 50% soil to compost by volume. That's the only time you do that. In the fall, from now forward, you really only add 1 or 2 inches to the surface of the soil. You can mix it in a little bit, or you can leave it right on the top. I highly recommend using a mulch to cover and protect your soil over the winter. So again, leaves are free in the fall, so they're the easiest. You might want to lay a few like wooden stakes or something so they don't blow away. They'll stay there most of the winter by that point. Keep your soil nice and moist and soft, and you will be thankful because in the spring, you're going to uncover your garden and pull back that mulch, and you're going to have lovely black crumbly dirt, and you can literally just plant right into it. So this is the only season, that first season, when you have to do all of that prep work. Remember, you know, planting, I love, this is my favorite quote, to plant a garden is to believe in tomorrow. You know, again, congratulations on coming and taking this first step. I have to put up our copyright policy. As I said, you know, anything that you want to share, we encourage you to share and encourage other people to garden, but please make sure you're not taking anything and claiming it as your own. Okay, I'm gonna stop my sharing. I'm gonna come back. What time is it? It's like, I have a couple of minutes to answer some questions. So I'm gonna ask Kathy to come back and join me. And if there's any questions that you want me to answer now, if you guys want to take off and go, if anybody needs the handout again, I can reshare that link if you want. I don't know if everyone, actually, I'll just go ahead and do that because I'm not sure if everyone got a chance to
I just
download
put it in the Q&A, but you can put it in the chat again.
Okay, I'm gonna pop it back into the chat just in case. Again, you can download it and keep it and for your reference. So what questions do we have, Kathy?
This one is perfect for you. Chicken waste. Can I add my chicken waste into my garden, and how much?
Sure, yes, and congratulations. I love chickens. Yes, chicken manure, any manure, but especially chicken, is really high in nitrogen. And so the chance is that it will burn your plants. So what you want to do with any manure is make sure it's fully composted. So if you have chickens in your yard, have a compost pile, mix the chicken manure with some leaves and straw and other vegetable scraps, leave it for, you know, about 6 to 8 months, a year, whatever, until it's fully broken down, and then you can use it. And there should not be any issue with that. But you don't want to put it on fresh into your garden because it will damage the plants.
Are the charts and diagrams included in your document link?
They are not, no, but if you want a copy of any of the charts or diagrams specifically, first of all, you could probably look them up on Google Images and find similar stuff. But if you need a specific thing, you can always just email us at that cg@dukefarms.org, and I'll be happy to share specific photos with you.
A question about, could I build my bed on concrete?
So a garden bed built on concrete is akin to a container. So anytime you don't have access to like the ground for water and for nutrients, it's like putting it in a pot, which you certainly can do. You want to make sure you use really high quality topsoil and a good quality compost. You definitely have to use fertilizer if you do that. If you're growing in containers or growing on concrete, you need to make sure you're fertilizing on a regular basis, because what's happening is most plants are reaching down into the soil and then, you know, they're extracting nutrients from the soil. And so when they're on concrete, you reduce that. But yeah, you can do that if that's the situation you have.
You probably mentioned this, but somebody asked what the correct height for a raised bed is.
Yeah, I did. I don't think I said it, but it was in the note page. I usually buy wood. If you're going to be buying wood, I usually recommend a 2x6 or 2x8. So the 6-inch or 8-inch wood is plenty. I think 6 inches is fine. If you have a little bit of a drainage problem or some really heavy soil, maybe go for 8-inch. And that's perfect height. If you're just going to be mounding up the soil, you know, you're not really measuring it. So I would say mound it as, you know, however high up you can get. The reason those nice mounds of soil are helpful is because they help to drain the water, you know, that you're getting the soil up above sort of grade, and it's going to drain a little bit better for you.
There's just so many.
I know.
Seed starting, could you recommend a good seed starting reference other than your class?
Other than my class. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's a million YouTube. I feel like you guys don't even need me probably, because there's so much stuff on YouTube there these days. But I don't know one specifically off the top of my head. I love like books. I'm a book girl. And so I love the Vegetable Gardener's Bible. Kathy, do you know who wrote that? I can't remember off the top of my head. But if you look up Vegetable Gardener's Bible, there's
a great book.
Yeah, there's some good information about specific crops and, starting seeds and all kinds of stuff. So that's a good reference for you, but I don't know, a site online off the top of my head.
But I know there are a million YouTube videos.
That's for sure.
I don't know how much longer you want to go.
You can go. I mean, if people need to leave, that's fine. Thank you for joining. If you want to hang out, I can stay for another 5 minutes. We'll see if we can get another few questions.
So I have a small greenhouse cover. How much earlier can I place seedlings out because of this?
Oh, the written answer to that is it's like one growing zone. So, probably a couple weeks, maybe 2 weeks earlier, you could put stuff out if you have like a plastic, sort of hoops under a plastic, which would be like a little mini greenhouse or something. But you need to be aware that that needs to be vented. It's a little trickier than that, because if it gets warm during the day, then it's going to get too warm. So you need to make sure it gets vented. So do a little research on that, or just try it and don't worry if you fail or succeed.
How do you deal with squirrels stealing the vegetables? Last season,
thank you for asking that. Yes, that was on my list of things that I wanted to talk about. I don't know how that didn't make it into the presentation. So there's mammals that are pests, and then there are insects. So the big mammal that we have around here is deer. You definitely want to exclude deer from your garden. If you put up a fence or, block them out somehow, that's your best bet, because they can be really devastating. Things like groundhogs are going to burrow underneath fencing. That's kind of a pain, but if you dig the fencing in the ground, sometimes that helps. Squirrels, there is literally no way to exclude a squirrel, because they can climb and they can go through tiny openings. Mice and voles are pests as well. Rabbits. I mean, these are things that really you need to sort of embrace and live alongside of. Some people put out like shiny whirligigs. Some people put out radios that's supposed to deter animals. Some people shave like Irish Spring soap or garlic mist. I mean, there's all kinds of anecdotal things that you can do to deter animals eating stuff, sprinkling on cayenne pepper. There is a product called Plant Skid, PLANTSKYD, which is basically blood meal and some other ingredients. And the taste of the blood, the smell of the blood will deter prey animals like rabbits and squirrels. But of course, it's not going to last forever. You need to put it on there, and if it rains, you need to reapply it. But you might try that, and let me know if you figure out the answer to that, so I can share it widely.
Crop rotation.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, can you discuss the concept of crop and garden rotation a bit?
Sure. I didn't go too much into crop rotation. I kind of touched on it because I just feel like if it is truly your first year, you want to just kind of get everything planted and not worry about next year. But crop rotation, the simplest way to think about it is you don't plant the same things in the same spot 2 years in a row. So if you plant tomatoes in one bed this year, then next year you plant it in another bed. And it goes by plant family. So I mentioned, tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant are all in the tomato family. So you want to rotate them together. And then maybe in their spot next year, you're going to plant cabbage and lettuce, which are in a different family. And you can get much more in depth if you look up even like a Google image of a crop rotation plan, you can find a lot of different ideas, and you can add that into your sketch. Grow Veg has crop rotation plans embedded into it. So if you do one plan this year, next year when you try to sketch in a crop, it will say, no, you shouldn't put it there because of rotation. Oh yeah, someone just shared the Vegetable Gardener's Bible. That's the one that I love so much. Yeah,
great book.
Robert C. Smith. And that has information of crop rotation in there as well. So why don't we is there one last question you have?
Marigolds. Somebody is very curious about if marigolds will help as a bug repellent.
Yes and no. Some people swear by it. Other people say it's, you know, it's not that effective. What I will say is planting flowers in and around your vegetable plants is going to help with pollination, and is also going to help attract some of the beneficial insects that are going to eat the bad bugs. And so there's different, you know, amounts. So people will say like nasturtium is really good companion plant for that. Marigolds are really good. Zinnia are really good for pollinators. So if you have a pot of zinnia, you're going to attract some more bees. So there's all different reasons for having flowers, not only because they're beautiful, but because they are beneficial in many ways. So I would say absolutely pop in some marigolds. It won't be the end to all of your problems, but it will certainly not hurt anything.
Are they getting the recording?
We are not sharing a recording this time. Yes, we are not. But there is that little video that I did, the planting, whatever that was, transplants. That's on our YouTube page. And there are other videos about vegetable gardening on the Duke Farms YouTube page. So good luck to all of you. We have another couple classes coming up, and I hope that you join us again. And thank you for your time this afternoon, and have a lovely rest of your day. And thank you, Kathy. Have a good one.
Bye, everybody.